Hi, my name is Natalie de Torre Salas, and I am the public archaeologist for FPAN Southwest region. And today you're going to listen about our talk called Weeds and Seeds, where we teach about what is archaeology and how can it help us about understanding what people were eating in Southwest Florida over 2,000 years ago to colonial times. Hope you enjoy it. What is the Florida Public Archaeology Network, which is what I'm going to begin with? So we're a statewide educational organization, and we are dedicated to promote and facilitate the conservation, the study, and the public understanding of Florida's archaeological heritage. So, for example, in this image over here, you can see that we're cleaning a tombstone, and you might think, maybe when I think about archaeology, I do not necessarily think about historical cemeteries. But yes, they are an incredible historical and cultural resource that we have. It is where we have our family members and our ancestors laid to rest. And they're like open air museums. And because they're open air, unfortunately, they are usually impacted by the weather and, Florida's overall wilderness. So we do also help other people take care of them. And we also get to do other pretty cool stuff. For example, this is my colleague Sarah Miller documenting a shipwreck that washed ashore back when Hurricane Matthew, impacted Florida. So that kind of interesting things. However, our main mission is a tripartite one. So our main goal is to do education and outreach. So doing things like coming today here and seeing all of you is one of the things that we enjoy doing the most. But we also assist local governments, and we also assist the State Division of Historical Resources. And this is something that every single state in the United States has. And like I mentioned before, FPAN is all over the state of Florida, and here in South Florida, we are hosted by Florida Atlantic University. I am based in Fort Myers, so I run all over Southwest Florida. So I apologize if you saw me frantically getting everything set up as I drove from Fort Myers. So, no cheating. So when I say archaeology, and you guys have already heard this, you might have heard Crystal talk about archaeology before. What is the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear that word? Archaeology. And don't be shy, this is where I ask you to interact with me, even though I'm in this tall podium.
A dig.
A dig? What am I digging for?
Bones.
Bones? Somebody said something besides bones? Somebody said mummies? I like where you're going. Okay, artifacts. Why am I interested in artifacts, bones, maybe mummies?
The past.
The past, exactly. So pretty much that's what archaeology is. We're interested in uncovering the things that people left behind so we can tell a story about the past, right? So I like to tell people, imagine that we're in this room, right, and we're gonna leave our cell phones, our glasses, our bags, everything that we have, and just leave it as it is. And let's wait for 1,000 years to pass. And an archaeologist is gonna come to this auditorium and he's gonna be like, what was happening in this room? What were these people up to? All right, does it sound easy? It's not, but it's super amazing. It is a science, right? And that's what we try to do, to interpret and tell a story about the past, right? About past human behavior. And here in the United States is one of those unique places where when we are talking about archaeology, we also have to talk about anthropology, which is the study of, people's cultures and human beings. And in the United States, different to Europe and other countries, archaeology is a subfield of anthropology. So if you're interested in studying people's cultures, you study sociocultural anthropology. If you're interested in bones, crime, that you study biological anthropology. If you're interested in linguistics, how people communicate, the different words, how a language, changes through time, you're interested in linguistic anthropology. And if you're interested in the past of human beings, you're interested in archaeology. And this is a picture of my incredible colleagues, Sarah A. Rixby and Rachel Kangas, doing ground penetrating radar. So I know you guys said digging when you thought about the word archaeology, but actually you don't necessarily need to dig in order to learn about the past. In fact, me and some of my colleagues are really passionate about non-invasive ways of doing archaeology. So using technologies like ground penetrating radar, which is like this fancy machine that allows you to get readings of what is, below the ground, and LiDAR satellites and other things are also very useful. There's also underwater archaeology that is incredible to practice here in Florida. And this is an image of us teaching students from different universities in Florida in Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse. So before I continue, I want to thank you all for not saying the word dinosaur when I asked about archaeology. You all deserve a round of applause. Thank you for being the first group of people who didn't say dinosaurs. So although they're really cool, fun fact, there were never dinosaurs in Florida. 2.5 million years ago, when dinosaurs went extinct, Florida was underwater, right? We do, however, have mega fauna, these incredible animals that, you know, did live in Florida and that we can find in the form of fossils. So fossils are evidence of living things that have been preserved in the Earth's crust. However, you guys said it, we're interested in artifacts. And artifacts are items that have been made, used, or modified by humans. So a piece of shell stops being simply a piece of shell when we give it a purpose, when we modify it in order to have a purpose for us, okay? And many people ask me, so how do I know when an object becomes an artifact? When an object is 50 years or older is what we then call an artifact. I said artifact. I said object. So, when we talk about archaeologists' past, or Florida's past, I want to make sure also that everybody is awake. I know it's important to have the 3 o'clock coffee. So how long did you guys think that there have been humans in Florida? And we're going to do a quick show of hands. So who says people first arrived in Florida 2,000 years ago? Okay, we have a few hands. Who says 8,000 years ago? Okay, we have more hands. And who says 14,000 years ago? Ding, 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 yes, people have been living in Florida for over 14,000 years ago. It's a lot. A lot has been happening in Florida. And however, we're not going to go all the way back to 14,000 years ago for this talk, but we are going to start approximately 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, something that we archaeologists like to call the archaic period. And in order to make our lives easier, we just simply break time into these manageable chunks that we call period, right? So over 2,000 years ago, we call this as well the archaic. And in this particular moment in time, things in Florida are changing significantly. Why? Because 14,000 years ago, Florida was going through its last ice age. So Florida used to be very dry and very cool and looked completely different than what it looks like today. And people 2,000 years ago were starting to see this change where everything, instead of being dry and ice, all of that ice melted. We have an increase in sea level. There's a lot of precipitation in the atmosphere, which means rain. And it is during this time that the Everglades is born. So how impactful, how incredible would be for these people that were living at that time to see that change all of a sudden, right? So we have the Lake Okeechobee is born, the Everglades is born, and we also see people settle into communities more, right? They don't have the need to be moving as much because there is more water, more resources to find. So we do start finding ceramics. 14,000 years ago, it's very complex, very difficult to find pieces of ceramic, right? Because if you're moving constantly, you don't want to be moving around with a lot of like ceramic in your back, right? But when you settle somewhere, you're like, maybe I can start playing with clay a bit more. So we do find things like this in the archaeological record, and we archaeologists aren't the most creative, poetic people. So this is called sand-tempered plain. Why? Because it's tempered with sand and it's plain. So yeah, kudos to archaeologists for having these lovely names for pottery. Besides that, we do start seeing a more diverse stone tool assemblage. So as people start settling places, building homes, right? People need more tools to build things, canoes, houses, structures, fight and whatnot, and we also find that sort of things. So we know that people at that time, however, were still living seasonally, right? Just like nowadays you might live 6 months out of the year in Ohio and then the other here in Florida, people in the past were doing similar things. And this picture here is an image from Wedgeworth Archaeological Site in West Palm Beach County. And do any of you can guess what that smoke is? That's a Florida Gulf Coast University and other archaeologists and universities were working there back in 2018. And the reason you see that smoke in the background is because that is actually a sugarcane field. And many people would have thought, you know what, why excavate, why do archaeology in a sugarcane field when people have been working the land for so long, you're not going to find anything. They were wrong. They found evidence that people were living there for thousands of years because that right there, the sugarcane field, used to be a tree island. And if you've ever gone to the Everglades, you can see millions and millions of tree islands because they are the only dry spot in the Everglades. And that's where people were living and thriving back in that archaic period. So, there's a lot of traditions centered around food, and that's the reason why you came here, right? We eat popcorns where? At the theater. We eat hot dogs where? Yes, baseball stadiums. And we eat peanuts where? At the bar or plane, right? But what are the foods that come to mind when we think about Florida? It might look like something like this, right? Bananas, kumquat, mangoes, sugarcane, horses, and other animals. But again, in fact, Florida's native environment was much different thousands of years ago. So which one of these foods do you think is native to Florida? Somebody said mango? Okay, one person said mango. Anybody else has any other idea which one is? There's only one that is native to Florida.
Tomato.
Sugarcane.
Sugarcane. Very interesting choices. Actually, it's the papaya. It's the only fruit considered native to Florida. It blew my mind as well when I first learned about this, okay? And even that only seems to date 1,700 years ago, so around 300 AD in Lee County. So excavations in Lee County, they does give us that important data that tells us, right, that is the oldest and most native fruit that we have here in Southwest Florida. All the rest were introduced by Europeans. None of the other crops like citrus or mangoes or sugarcane are native to the US and probably were not commercially cultivated in South Florida before the 1920s. So within the last 500 years, the landscape in Florida has completely changed. And in order to find out what people were eating before all of Spanish European conquistadors arrived in Florida, we have to go a little bit further back. And how do we go a bit further back? Well, unfortunately, I do not have a time machine, but I do have archaeology, and it's pretty close, right? It's the closest thing we have to that. So within archaeology, we have very different subfields. We like to specialize in topics. I have a friend that specializes in what people were eating. I have a friend that specializes only in animal bones. I have a friend that specializes only in battlefield archaeology, wars in historic periods. So, you know, you can just emphasize and specialize in whichever topic you're passionate about. And that's how we get this wonderful, interesting subfields, these different sciences, and one of them is called archaeobotany. So it's a study of past human-plant interactions through the recovery and analysis of ancient plant remains. So, how does this work when we're out there? We do something called outdoor archaeological flotation units. So we're interested not so much in the big artifacts, we're interested in the micro artifacts that also tells us a big part of that story, right? They're very important pieces of that puzzle. And it's just, this is a laboratory technique where you again recover tiny artifacts and plant remains from soil samples by using water, and only the things that float are the micro artifacts. Anything else just stays in the bottom. So for example, these are carbonized remains of a variety of fruit stones from an archaeological site in Scotland, right? So you may see that and you're like, that's only dirt, that's not important. But that tells you the story of what people were eating in Scotland hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And then that's why it's so important to actually carry out lab work. When we also talk about archaeology specifically, archaeobotany, so we can study under the microscope what it is that we are finding. Another type of subfield that is super important to try to understand and study what people were eating, consuming back in the day, it's called zooarchaeology. And this is a subfield of archaeology that specializes in remains of animals, right, uncovered from archaeological sites, and the goal again is to understand past human life. So faunal remains, and that is the same as, animal bones, are those items left behind when an animal dies. And this includes bones, shells, hair, scales, hides, proteins, and even DNA. And again, no person can memorize every single type of animal that existed and currently exists in this world. So it's very important that we have a collection, a comparative collection. So whenever I find a piece of bone, I'm like, let me see if I find one that matches in the database. Okay, there we go. And thankfully, here we have a wonderful comparative collection from the Florida Museum of Natural History. That's an image of all of that are lots of animal bones that you can use to study. And that's pretty much what an archaeologist uses in order to study skeletons and shells that have been found in archaeological sites, and that can provide key information about human diet. So, where do we look for if we're interested in finding out what people were eating? Here in Florida, we look for something called mounds or middens. I had the opportunity years ago to dig in the latrine. It smelled terrible. So I am very glad that instead of digging in a very old bathroom, I'm just digging in somebody else's kitchen or house a long time ago. Trust me, that smell can survive for thousands of years. So middens are actually trash of prehistoric trash piles, pretty much, right? People were eating shell, or they would break pieces of pottery and would throw them out into a corner until they look like small lower mounds, and that's what we call middens. And mounds are more intentional earthworks that we find here in Florida, especially in South Florida. So many of you think about archaeology and think about Egyptology and the pyramids, but know that here in Florida we had this wonderful, incredible earthworks that were just as important and even older than Egypt's pyramids. Unfortunately, we do still have some of them, but they're not the same size nor the same quantity as we've had in the past, right? So mounds and middens are very important because that's where people were throwing out the things that they were consuming and eating. And it tells us that story, that domestic story of what was happening in that area, maybe in that home or that communal space. And we also have to understand that mounds at some point were considered symbols of power, right? The taller the mound was, the more powerful maybe, or the more social status you had. And we're talking about, indigenous groups like the Calusa. So mounds and middens were made to change the landscape on purpose. And this is a shell midden that was excavated in approximately 1912 to 1920s in the Ponce de Leon inlet. But this is a picture that I took a week before Hurricane Ian when I was digging in Mound House in Fort Myers Beach. Have you ever gone there? No, they had this wonderful mound exhibition, and we were there cleaning and finishing excavations there, and look at that gorgeous, incredible 2,000-year-old mound. And you can see all of the different layers of straight up, the different shell that people were, using, consuming, and leaving behind. So the diets of Florida's indigenous peoples were reconstructed mainly from two sources: accounts by priests and other Europeans, and food remains at archaeological sites, but also thanks to indigenous knowledge. And until recently, in fact, almost all that was known about the biological consequences of contact with the Europeans was based on old documents, which only emphasized epidemics and population collapse and disease and all of that. So when I tell people that we often use historical documents and history as another source of evidence to help us tell that story, we need to be very careful and do as the saying says, take it with a pinch of salt. Why? Because when we're looking at a historical document, we have to question and think, who wrote it, for who, and what was the purpose, right? We all lie nowadays, right? You may send a text saying, oh yeah, I'm almost there. You're still showering at home. Who says that somebody else didn't do the same thing in their diaries or in their letters? So we need to be very critical about what we find. And an example of this is, there was an artist called Randell, and I don't speak French, so I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And this image shows people processing grain and cooking. And what I wonder when I see that image is what plants were used for the firewood, for the baskets, the handle, the clothing, and other items in addition to the grain. So people have been using resources from their environment to their advantage since the very beginning, okay? Even today. And he made these sketchings of many different tribes throughout the continent. And supposedly, he got inspiration from another artist that had done all of his work based on a different indigenous group called the Algonquin in North Carolina. And he decided, you know, I've never met him, I've never seen the original drawings, but I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna make it my own, and I'm gonna say that it was all the people from South Florida, I'm gonna draw them. And that's when we have like images of, okay, what were people cooking and using in the past? That's what we have. The images from this guy who never met the other artist and just pretty much plagiarized it, extrapolated information, said this is what every indigenous people in South Florida does. Quality. So that's the problem. His depictions were used to make interpretations about indigenous people and other tribes. And many scholars for a long time took that literally. And that's why it's so important as well to know that there's still indigenous people here in South Florida. We have the Seminole tribe of Florida, the Miccosukee tribe of Indians, and many others that still hold that incredible and rich traditional knowledge and oral history that to this day, you know, tell us and can inform better our research and our work. We don't have to necessarily just, you know, look at historical documents, right? And the descendants of the indigenous people of Florida are still here, and they can really, really help us out with their knowledge. Especially since they have lived in balance with their land for thousands of years, something that nowadays we are struggling with, right? How to use ways of cultivating the land in more sustainable ways. And this is a postcard of the Seminole tribe of Florida. And this is very interesting because when we talk about our people moving around thousands of years ago down in the Everglades, they were moving by building canals and using different types of canoes. And the Seminoles used to do the same thing. They had the ways of processing plants that were the same ways that people would have done 2,000 years ago. So how did people get food in the past? And South Florida is very interesting because it's very different to the rest of North Florida and the rest of the United States. And you're gonna learn in a bit why that is. But here in South Florida, there were a lot of estuarine and ocean environments, meaning that people had access to food 24/7. And I know that it's very difficult to imagine a world where there is no DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Publix, but they didn't really have to struggle that much. Look at the wonderful marine resources that we still have, right? And they also did hunting and gathering. So there was a combination of plants, vegetables, roots, and grains. And at the time of European contact, maize was not a thing. And many people thought that anywhere in the world where there was a complex society, there needed to be agriculture. There needed to be maize. Not in South Florida. First of all, the soil here, not good for agriculture. Right? You know what I'm talking about. And again, why bother learning agriculture when you can fish? When you have all these other wonderful plants and, let me see if I can change the slide. Yes. But besides aquaculture, which is another word for, you know, only farming marine resources, by using things like, please don't make fun of my very entangled type of fishing net. So people in the past would have been using a lot of different fishing nets to catch very different types of fish. And we know this because we find evidence of this in the archaeological record. So I ask you, now that you're looking at this very tangled, I'm sorry about that, fishing net, what do you think survives? What do you think archaeologists are able to find? The shell weights, correct. What else? Fish bones, that's very good. We can find fish bones next to the net, so we know, oh, they found this or grabbed this with that. We also find the nuts. The nuts. Although all of this is made with organic material, plant fibers and organic material that will decompose, the nuts often get stuck in mud. And when something gets stuck in mud, it means that there will be no oxygen. And when there is no oxygen, there is no bacteria that eats that organic material. So we're able to find that, and that is super incredible and fascinating because it shows us the different types of fishing techniques that people would have used in the past, whether that was for a mullet run or any other sort of fishing. I do not fish, so my knowledge of fish is a bit limited here. But besides that, for decades, it had been assumed that men acted as the hunters and women acted as the gatherers. And that is wrong, wrong, wrong. And throughout the Americas, there have been many burials of women that show injuries of big game hunting. And in fact, many women were buried with their hunting toolkit. So in the past, anthropology and archaeology was a very male-dominated field. And when we're social scientists and we're trying to understand a society and a culture that we just simply don't know, I always tell people that you need to take off your glasses. And you cannot put on your own biases and understandings into interpreting another group of people's lives and culture and society overall, right? So people back in the day, men mostly were like, no, women can't do hunting, no. And it's like, but that woman was buried with it. That should have been a mistake somebody did 9,000 years ago. Like, until finally, the discipline is breaking from that. And for example, back in 2020, the University of California in Davie found this burial in Los Andes Mountains in South America of this woman who was buried with her hunting toolkit. And they were even able to find a bit of remnants of her clothes, which were a bit of a red orchid color. And this is actually an image that they made with all of the information they found from the archaeological site. And they tried to, make it like that. And you can see the color of her clothes. Here you can see an image of the actual hunting toolkit that she was buried with. The axes and all of that made out of stone. And if you look at her, she's using this. And have any of you seen this before? What is it called? The ablado, yes, one of the most awesome tools ever. So the ablado means water stick in Nahuatl, which is an indigenous language in South America. And why do you think people would use this for? No idea? For hunting. So if I were to put an arrow here, which I left in the car because I don't want nobody to get harmed, I would put it here and just using my wrist, that would give me incredible leverage. And that arrow would fly and I would be able to hunt these cute little creatures over here, animals. So this is a replica, by the way, this is not a real thing. But yes, that's why I love telling people about this because everybody gets shocked. And yes, 15% of big game hunters were women, and to this day, many indigenous women in other parts of the world continue to use instruments like the ablado to hunt. So, what was the menu here in Southwest Florida 10,000 years ago? I want you to know that I am not an expert in super ancient food, but I will try my best to share the knowledge that I have. So we know that plants have some kind of purpose, whether that is for food, for medicine, for crafting, or simply because they're just beautiful and they look very well in your living room. Nevertheless, analysis of the evidence of plants have revealed that indigenous people ate very incredible amount of plant species, both wild and domesticated, even after the arrival of Europeans. And Europeans, in fact, brought seeds of oranges, lemons, again, all of the citrus that Florida is now known for, those were all brought by the Europeans. However, they never grew well besides citrus because when the Europeans came here, they were focused on other things and not really on cultivating stuff, so they just ran wild, and that's why many people say that the first people to settle and bring European food were actually Mallorcans, Greeks, and Italians. They were, while the Spanish were like looking where to go, they settled and decided, we can actually plant stuff more similar to our homelands, like eggplants and olives and lemons. So thanks to them is that those thrived quite well here in South Florida. But even before that, the plants that were that were consumed a lot here were alligator grass, the arrowhead, the water lily, and my favorite, the kunti. Have you guys heard about the kunti before? Yes? What do you know about the kunti?
They made flour out of it.
Yes, they make flour. So what my favorite fact about the kunti is that if you do not process it correctly, it's very poisonous. You will die. So in my brain, right, the first thing that I think is like, who in the past ate that plant and died? It was like, let's try to eat this. Bob died. Let's try to boil it for the first time. Here, Bob number 2, eat this plant. Bob number 2 dies. Let me try to boil it twice. Let's see what happens. Bob number 3, come over. Oh my God, you're alive. Wow, and that knowledge was passed around, and to this day, although we know kunti is terribly poisonous and can kill you, we have that traditional knowledge of how to process it and how to make bread. And the Seminole are experts at processing the kunti. They are the ones who, perfected the technique and use that constantly in their own lives. And one of my other favorite facts that I learned at the Atlatiki Museum, which is the museum in Clewiston, run by the Seminole Tribe of Florida, is that during the Seminole War, they would make 2 types of bread with kunti. One processed correctly, where they would eat, and one that they would not process correctly, and they would leave in their camp. So when the soldiers would like attack them, they'll be like, ha ha ha, I'm gonna get your bread. I'm hungry, and they would die. And it's the most incredible, laid-back war technique I've ever heard about, killing someone with the power of bread. That's awesome. So, besides plants, people were also consuming lots of animals, and fish and alligator, no surprise there, were surprisingly common, including 2 species of shark, including the lemon and the tiger one. And tiger shark weren't only very good for eating, but also for making tools. So, I don't know if you've noticed from my artifacts over here, you're gonna see that, right, shell is a main component when we are talking about artifacts, and we do not find a lot of artifacts made out of stone. First of all, there's no good sure material here in South Florida, and why bother with stone when you have the most wonderful resource of all, shell. Shell is so great, and any tool that we have nowadays, with the exception of microphones, cameras, and laptops, people in the past had their own version made out of shell. And when they didn't use shell, they used animal bones. And this is a knife made out, this is a replica, anyway, made out of tiger shark tooth. And they would use knives and weapons with that. We also know that they had a diet predominantly based out of fresh water and just a little bit of saltwater resources. For example, when we're talking about saltwater, I'm referring about soft-shell turtle and alligator from the sawgrass. And turtles are very interesting because, yes, they were consumed a lot. And when people ask why, well, think about it. It's, you have the meat that comes with its own bowl. And I know it sounds very problematic, but it's the truth. It was very convenient in the past to eat turtles. But fish, like I mentioned before, is also a must in Southwest Florida's ancient diet, and fish like bluegill, flyer, warmouth perch, mullet, and spotted sunfish are one of the most that we find in the archaeological record. So, what makes South Florida so unique? I already mentioned it, but I want to make sure that you guys are paying attention. What makes South Florida so much different than the rest? Lousy soil. You're going right.
Goes from the ocean and the water.
And because there's a lot of ocean and there was a lousy soil, what ended up happening? A lot of fish. So there was never agriculture in South Florida, and again, North Florida did have agriculture, the rest of the United States had, but not here. Okay, so that's, again, one of the reasons that this was such incredible discovery is that scientists used to say in the past that in order for society to be complex, you needed to have agriculture. Because having control over food, having control over resources would allow you to be, hey, I want you to build this mound, I want you to build this pyramid, you want food for the winter? Do it for me. And that's how they would define complex societies. However, people were managing their water resources, right? They still reached that level of complexity without the need of agriculture. So that's why the subtropical environment has made for such a different story in comparison to the rest of Florida. And this is one of my favorite pictures because we're talking about what people were eating, where people were moving thousands of years ago, but we also need to remember that Florida looked very different, okay? 14,000 years ago, it was very dry and cool, last ice age. Then we have the Everglades, like Okeechobee is born. Things get a bit more similar to what we have now. But Florida used to be bigger, way bigger. And if you see this image, this first layer is how Florida would have been 6,000 years ago. This second one is how it would have been 8,000 years ago, and the other one 10,000 years ago. So when we're talking about understanding the past and the lives of these people, right, we continue to find archaeological sites that help us interpret that. But we haven't found all of the places people would have lived and thrived in Southwest Florida thousands of years ago. Do you want to know why? They're underwater. So remember what I mentioned, here there's a lot of potential in South Florida for a lot of underwater archaeology. And it's fantastic, although it is a bit dangerous and a bit costly, but we still have a lot of our colleagues still trying to tell stories about what was happening by using underwater archaeology that do not necessarily relate to Pirates of the Caribbean and, you know, shipwrecks and all of that. There's, you know, see, I say underwater archaeology, people are like, treasures, and I'm like, no, not at all. But now we're going to fast forward a bit to colonial times, right? And colonialism brought with it, unfortunately, many terrible things, and one of them was the encomienda system. And the encomienda system was a very catastrophic disruption of the traditional foodways. And this happened in all of the Spanish colonies in all of the Americas, okay? And based on that Reconquista era, the encomienda system was brought from Spain and Portugal, but it looked very much like chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is just one type of slavery, and it's the one where you consider another human being as your property. And that's what was happening, unfortunately, here in South Florida, and we have evidence of this from the Spanish missions in places like San Agustin, with the Appalachian indigenous people. So colonialism definitely interrupted the way that people were finding food, preparing food, and consuming food. People were displaced from their land that they were used to, you know, understand where to fish, where to hunt, where to eat plants, and so on. People, indigenous people, were also confronted with the fact that there were new animals that they hadn't seen before, and new fruits and other things that they needed to get acquainted with, rather. And that, again, also disrupted traditional foodways. And starting in the early to mid 1700s, here in Southwest Florida, there were Cuban fishermen that began sailing the Gulf Coast of Florida. Have you ever heard about the Cuban fishermen?
Yes.
It's super, super interesting, super fascinating. So they would set up seasonal camps and fish with nets here for 4 to 6 months, and they would dry their catch using salt from Cayo Sal, which is an island over here in Southwest Florida, and then they would bring all of that fish back to Cuba. And the rancho season ended kind of like between January or early February, so they could return to Cuba by the time it was Lent, because you know that when it's Lent, you can't eat meat. So they brought all that fish back to Cuba when the demand for fish was at its highest. And in the summer, they would use their boats, once again, grab the salt from Cayo Sal, which is an island between Cuba, Florida, and the Bahamas, and they would use that same salt to preserve their fish later that year. So this is super interesting, and this is an image of palmetto thatch huts of where Cuban fishermen would have lived. And unfortunately, the American government at some point, because many of the Cuban fishermen were also Seminoles, were also black people, the government did a whole thing so they would eradicate all of the Cuban fishermen, and so that got lost at some point during the 19th century. 19th century, 20th century. So now we're going to move to the Reconstruction era, which is something that happened between 1861 and 1900, and it is a historic period where the United States was grappling with the question of how to integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into social, political, and work life. And it was a very interesting time of transition within the United States. And historical accounts state that African Americans in Lee County owned millions of farm property in Florida, millions worth of money in farm property. And in the year 1900, it doubled. So when the Spanish were still here in Florida, they made a law that allowed for anyone, absolutely anyone, including African Americans, to own land. And unfortunately, when the United States, became full government, they were like, nope. So unfortunately, this is another moment in time in the history of Southwest Florida where people who were living here and thriving here under still very tense circumstances, like it was slavery, they were once again forced to get out of their properties where for generations they were already farming and producing their own foods. So this is again something that we see especially after the Civil War, and in the 1920 census it shows that more than 1/3 of the African American families in Lee County unfortunately were removed forcefully from their farms. So now that I paint this picture of how terrible and how impactful the consequences of colonialism have on different types of communities and different types of people through time, one of the main consequences of this, besides violation to human rights, is the loss of knowledge, okay? So trespassing laws were passed as well that criminalized African Americans and indigenous people to collect food. Now imagine you no longer have your farm, you were displaced from the area where your family has lived for generations, you're trying desperately to get food, and they passed a law that will criminalize you search for that. So that also played a huge part in why we're still trying to understand the different ways that people have prepared and consumed food. And as that happens, people and society started moving to a more industrialized way of getting food. So supermarkets and stores in place of producing, right? Now we buy food, rarely do we plant and grow our own stuff, right? So knowledge of edible foods in Florida and hunting got lost in a few generations. Not completely, but a lot was lost. So how does colonialism affect food? And food has always been a fundamental tool in the presence of colonization, as I have mentioned before, and through food, social and cultural norms are conveyed, but also violated. So one of the ways humans colonize others is by attacking food access, from the historic killing of bison on the plains to starve Native Americans, to the damming of rivers and outlawing access to food sources for tribal communities. And so colonization not only deprived indigenous people of food and ceremony, but traditional food and its preparation were also lost along the way. And we do know that many indigenous people are now trying to recapture and revitalize that kind of lost knowledge. And that's something that we also see many people do, is that we went from trying to buy all of our food to once again understanding the importance of what our ancestors were doing, which were growing our own foods, right? We had Hurricane Ian pass through Florida, and most of us, it was difficult to access food. And how important would it have been to have maybe a good tomato plant, or your own basil, or your own orange tree in your backyard, something that was yours and you could have ready and accessible to you to give yourself food and give others in your community. So many people are now working towards decolonizing food, and that is the undoing of colonialism. It's in the way that we think, prepare, and consume food. And this is a wonderful example, a wonderful story about Chef Sean Sherman, who is the founder of the Sous Chef. It's a company committed to revitalizing and reclaiming Native American cuisine. And he's a member of the Ogallala Lakota Sioux tribe. And although he is trying to bring back indigenous food systems and tie it with land ownership, he says we're not cooking like it's 1491. Like, let's be real. We can never go exactly to how it was back in 1491. But he is preparing dishes in a way that reflects the Native American food cultures and using ingredients indigenous to North America before colonization. So if you're very interested in hearing about this story and how he has managed to do this, you can access the website of Natives, or Google him and you can read a lot about the wonderful things that he has accomplished. So my goal for today is not for you to go home and try to start eating a paleo diet. That is also that is not my goal for today. And when we're talking about ancient diets, what people were eating thousands of years ago, at some point in the early 2000s, there was a boom on the famous paleo diet. And everybody wanted to eat like our Paleo-Indian ancestors did. And right, it was people trying to find the ways that people would have eaten back in the Paleolithic era, which dates back to 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago. And we was like, what? So that meant sticking to the supposed eating patterns of eating lots of meat and fish, fresh fruit, vegetables, eggs, and nuts. But this diet is very restrictive, eating no grains, no refined sugar, no processed foods, dairy, or legumes, which are beans or lentils. And despite it being one of the most popular diets out there, not all healthcare professionals and researchers support this. So they believe this eating pattern may negatively impact your health because you're not eating all of the food groups you need, right? So the truth is, and one of the reasons that I bring this forward, is that our ancestors ate in a lot of ways. And there are millions of paleo diets, okay? People in East Africa ate differently than people from West Africa. People from West Africa ate different than people from the Middle East. And the Middle East ate differently from the people of South America. And people of South America ate differently than the people of North America. So once again, we have millions of paleo diets. That is something that we're still trying to understand, is that ancient human diets and different ways of living off the land and changing the landscape in order to feed yourself and your community. So when we're also talking about food and trying to understand how different was food back then compared to today, is that nowadays we have something called climate change, right? Very famous topic, very famous buzzword out there. And climate change is affecting our current food waste way more, right? Although climate change is a natural process that started 2.5 million years ago, because of us humans, we have accelerated the speed of climate change, and we have definitely damaged many of our environment, and that has consequences. We have floods, droughts, and more intense hurricanes, and heat waves and wildfires, which can drive down crop yields. It can destroy livestock. It can interfere with the transportation of food. If all of our food comes from elsewhere, and something like a hurricane happens, where are we going to get that food, especially if we don't grow our food anymore? So also rising carbon dioxide levels from all of the human activity, the cars, the planes, and whatnot, also makes crops like rice and wheat less nutritious. So we might be having the food, but it's not as nutritious and healthy as we think it may be because of those external factors. So in most of the places where food is grown today, crop yields are likely to be lower because of the more frequent heat waves and flooding and air pollution, okay? So this is something to also keep in mind when we're talking about food nowadays. And if you are thinking, what I'm eating today is something that 2,000 years ago here in Lee County someone was eating, it's another thing to also take into account. So if you're wondering, how can I continue to learn about the indigenous people here in Southwest Florida? Do not worry, there's so many places where you can go and continue to enjoy and learn. Don't take what I I'm just saying, just go and explore for yourself and learn, especially since March is Florida Archaeology Month, right? There are a lot of activities for all of you. So one of the fantastic places that you can visit, and it's where I was this morning, is Pineland Archaeological Site Complex, which is managed by Randell Research Center. It's near Boca. It's not too far from here, an hour and a half. And there you can see multiple different mounds. They only open a small trail. The rest is still, you know, in process of recovery because of Hurricane Ian. We also have Mound House in Fort Myers Beach, where you, before the hurricane, you were able to see a 2,000-year-old mound and all the different levels of straight up. They will try to reopen next month, however, not the mound exhibition. So if you're around the area and you want to support this very important heritage spaces, please do. But you also have Marco Island Historical Museum. And if you're a super fan of the Calusa, or the Muspe indigenous people, and you want to see the very famous Key Marco cat, which is this artifact of this cat that is like this big, and that it's on loan from the Smithsonian Museum until April of 2026, please do. And also Mount Key, which is managed by Croatian State Historic Site. So Mount Key was one of the major cities of the Calusa, which were the indigenous people, right, that were here when the Spanish arrived. And the Atatiki Museum. If you're super interested in learning more about Kunti, about indigenous ways of eating food, you want to support the Seminole Tribe of Florida and learn even more from them, please go. It's a fantastic, incredible museum. Gorgeous walk, and very good food nearby as well. So, this is the end of the talk. So if you guys have any questions or curiosities, please let me know. I mean, you've all been a fantastic audience. So, and I want you to remember what you've learned today. Learn about what is archaeology and how can both archaeology and history can continue to help us understand the food that we're eating and what was going on in the past, and why it is so important that we learn about how people in the past were thriving with the resources that they had, but they were using the resources in sustainable ways. So thank you so much for your time.